Okay, guys, we're back. Really excited about this one. So, pleasure to welcome Michael to TFFEMEA, and he's going to be talking about how a data visualization influenced the course of US history. Intrigued and excited. So, Michael, I know you're online. If you could take over the screen, and over to you, sir.
Okay. Can you hear me okay, everyone?
Yeah, so we can hear you really clearly. Yeah.
Okay. So before I start, I just want to say, wow, what an incredible presentation by Steve. It's a hard presentation to follow. That was pretty amazing. Let's say I'm the after dinner mint after this great meal you just had on tooltips. So let me bring up my presentation and put it into presentation mode. Everybody being able to see that?
So, Michael, I think you need to share your screen.
Oh, of course. Yes, share my screen and my desktop and share screen and
Perfect.
from the beginning.
Now
Is that better, folks?
Yeah, much better. Thank you.
Okay, hi everybody. My name is Mike Sandberg. I work as a data architect for the city of Glendale, Arizona. And I am going to tell you a story today. Over the course of me working with data visualization, having taken courses from Ed Tufte, Steve Few, Alberto Cairo, all of them love to tell stories, and they tell stories about, some of them have told stories about John Snow, about Menard's map, and I thought I would try to find a story that I haven't heard before. And so I came across this one, and it's basically a story about a data visualization that influenced the course of US history. So I'll just get started. So in 1860, Abraham Lincoln won the presidential election against Stephen Douglas and was elected president of the United States. Now, times in the United States it was a time of a lot of friction and tension. There was talk that if Lincoln was elected, that he would work to abolish slavery, and a lot of the southern states, which slavery helped them in their economic livelihood and their way of life at that time, were concerned about this. Concerned so much that after Lincoln was elected, a few days before Christmas, South Carolina seceded from the Union, and then was followed in January by Mississippi, Florida, and Alabama. And by the time Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, a little different than today where it's now January 20th, 7 states had vowed to leave the United States over the issue of slavery. In his first inaugural address, pardon me for a second here. In his first inaugural address, Lincoln declared, and he was trying to be very cautious here. He didn't want to have this mass exodus of states from the union that was the United States. I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it currently exists. But as time wore on, one particular visualization would play a role to change Abraham Lincoln's mind. In 1861, the U.S. Coastal Survey put out a map, and what it was a map of slave population of the southern states of the United States. And 1860 census was interesting in that it was the last year that the U.S. government collected census data on slaves. And so the map, as you look at it over here, you can see as you look from the east going south that there's a high prevalence of slavery by county in the southern states. And the way it was shown on this map is counties that had a higher propensity of slavery were a darker shade, and those that were less inclined to have slavery were lighter shades. And this map, when they drew it, was considered to be a groundbreaking cartographic technique at the time, as it depicted 4 million Americans that were bound in slavery. And as I mentioned already, by the shading, we see the highest concentration of slaves, as well as the parts of the Confederacy that might be also least committed to slavery. In other words, they had a real lower number of slaves in those counties and might not be as interested in leaving the Union on the issue of slavery. And I just wanted to point out here what we all know this as today, as a choropleth map, which are thematic maps in which areas are shaded or patterned in proportion to the measurements of the statistical variables. In this case, it's population density of slaves. It could be per capita income. And choropleth maps provide us an easy visual way of measuring variety across geographic areas, as well as show the variability of a region. So the map was visual proof that the South was heavily dependent on slave labor. It also gave the public a way to visualize the variation of slavery through the South. And this would be important as the Civil War erupted. More and more during the war, President Lincoln referred to this map and went back and reviewed it to help him make decisions that would help him end slavery. Ultimately, the map would help him determine or decide on issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And it also helped drive Union support for the abolition or the abolishment of slavery. He was able to show this visually to people and say, look at all these people in bondage. You know, this is part of the reason we need to work to abolish slavery. So again, here's the legend on the map. As you can see, the lighter shades were less than 10% of slavery, where the darkest shade is 80% or more of slavery. And so the U.S. Coastal Survey, who created this map, were really more responsible for mapping U.S. coastlines and waterways, at least when President Thomas Jefferson created the agency. That's what he had set their goal to be. And so it was unusual that they created this map because a slave map was really not in their job description. But it didn't stop them from creating this map. And as I've mentioned already, you know, to show population variations using shading. So here's an example. The dark black line going down the middle is the Mississippi River, and you have all these counties around there. And this is cotton country in the southern states. And so it was surprising. For example, you have Tensas County was 90.8% slaves. That means of the population there, probably 10%, a little less than 10% of them were probably plantation owners, slave owners, you know, people that ran their plantations, and the rest of the population was slaves. That's an extraordinary number. And many of these people that were slaves here came down here from Virginia in what was referred to as the Slavery Trail of Tears, where they were literally forced to walk over 1,000 miles from Virginia to go work on these plantations picking cotton. Now Lincoln, earlier in in the 1800s, 1828, 1831, was transporting farm goods to New Orleans, and so he saw a lot of this. But uh, paradoxically, is that you had larger southern cities like New Orleans, which had a very small percentage of slaves. 8.9% were made up of slaves. The rest of the population were white, or they were free slaves, or people that were slaves that had bought or earned their freedom. So what this was telling us as part of this narrative is that not all southern cities were keen on succeeding from the Union, or going to war over this issue. Where in the countrysides that were heavily dependent on economically to raise cotton and other crops, to earn their income, were very dependent on this. So here is what was more of a political cartoon at the time. It talked about the great snake of slavery that is surrounding the South. And a lot of the Confederate states used the rallying cry or the justification of states' rights to say, they had the right to have slaves. And as we talked about in the previous slide, and as I mentioned earlier, the South was very heavily dependent on slave labor. And, this included South Carolina, which led the rebellion against and first succeeded from the Union. So you had 4 million people that were in slavery, particularly along the Mississippi River, the Chesapeake Bay, the Georgia coast, and as I mentioned before, the Mississippi River Valley. Now, the map also would play out to show, as I mentioned, what parts of the Confederacy had little alliance to slavery, would also give them some military strategy in the war of areas they could enter the South to fight the Civil War, such as Eastern Tennessee and Western Virginia. And we'll look at that in just a second here. Historian Susan Schulten contended that the map that we're looking at, the 1861 Coastal Survey map, reinforced Lincoln's belief that certain Southern Unionists could break the Confederacy. In other words, there are people in the South that would help the Union win the Civil War and help them in their march down to the South to fight these battles. And as well as the South, now that they were their own country, were trying to set up trade relationships with foreign countries such as Britain and France, and do for the sale of their goods and cotton and such. And Lincoln had to think of ways or strategies to politically discourage them from working with the Confederate States or doing trade with the Confederate States to basically economically hurt them. So the census, the Coastal Census, also put out a second map, and this is a map of Virginia. And this map in particular was put out with the agenda to promote anti-slavery. And it was given to military generals, politicians. They even gave signed copies to foreign diplomats like Britain and France, because it was critical to the Union effort that they were able to persuade European nations that there is a lot of slavery in the South, and the European nations were more aligned to abolishing slavery than encouraging it. So they were trying to ensure that, again, those relationships, those trade relationships weren't set up. And one of the things I want to point out here in Virginia is, so this part of Virginia was very dependent on slavery, where the western part over here was not dependent on it at all. As a matter of fact, they had proposed breaking off and creating their own state called Kanawha, which actually eventually became West Virginia, which we'll talk about in a minute. And here we are. We will talk about it right now. So during the Civil War, 2 states actually joined the Union. One of them was Nevada. The second one was West Virginia. And the interesting thing about West Virginia, it is the only state that succeeded from the Confederate States to join the Union. And it was formally admitted into the Union as a new state in 1863. And the key thing about it is it was one of the Civil War border states. It provided a entry path for the Union Army to enter the South. The other thing, where we talk about the political aspects of the map, is at the top of the map, they put the word "sold for the benefit of the sick and wounded soldiers of the U.S. Army," and they sold us to raise funds to help the Union troops. And in this, by marketing or framing the map in this way, it was also used to help promote the political climate. Is one, we're letting you know that you buying this map and you looking at this map, you're helping the Union troops out. You're helping our guys. The thought then is you're helping our guys fight the war, win the war, and have money to continue to fight the war. And Schulten again argues that the map, when it came out, was a landmark cartographic achievement. It was a great propaganda tool, and ultimately it was an instrument of military policy. So again, as the more Lincoln looked at these 2 maps, the more he became convinced that he had to do what he could to get slavery abolished. And in 1864, he said, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." And Lincoln, since the 1850s, was arguing publicly that slavery was not only morally wrong, but slaves were people with inalienable rights. If you think back to our Constitution, we have these inalienable rights. But Lincoln didn't know how to end slavery. He first thought, well, we'll find a way to send the slaves back to Africa, which he referred to as colonization. Or what we could do is we could pay all the slaveholders some kind of compensation for freeing the slaves. So again, we're in the middle of the Civil War, and Robert E. Lee in 1862 led a whole group of troops into the Northern Territory, and you had the Battle of Antietam. And this battle is significant in that over 22,000 men died in this battle. And then, of course, Lee and his army retreated. And this was the most losses in a single day in American history for in a war battle. And Lincoln, at this point, Lincoln said, "This is enough." And so 5 days later, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, where he takes a very firm stand against slavery. So here's a copy of the Emancipation Proclamation. And basically what Lincoln stated in it, when it was released on January 1st of 1863, "All persons held as slaves in the Confederate States shall be then, thenceforth, and forever free." So it became a national proclamation that the Union stood for freedom. The Union was saying no slavery. Now, this was uh, a different mindset than Lincoln had earlier. He didn't mention at this point about colonization or returning the slaves back to Africa or compensating the South. He was taking a very firm stand saying, nope, we are not going to allow slavery. And in fact, we are going to offer all the slaves we just freed to come up, join the Union Army, and help us fight to abolish slavery. And of course, over 200,000 black soldiers did march under the Union flag. So as the war ended, or the war was evolving and it was coming near an end, um, Lincoln again always was referring to his 1861 coastal map. As I said, he owned a map and he relied on it. And as I mentioned Shelton earlier, she writes that the president relied on the map to determine how emancipation would affect the course of the war. So for 6 months, Francis Bicknell Carpenter lived at the White House, and he was painting a portrait of Lincoln titled "The First Reading of the Emancipation Proclamation of President Lincoln." And here is a picture of Lincoln and his advisors discussing the Emancipation Proclamation. And this painting today hangs in the U.S. Capitol building. Now, if ever you get a chance to see it, you're going to want to look in the lower right corner, because what Carpenter did very subtly is put a copy of the 1861 survey map right in the painting behind a chair, acknowledging the map's contribution to history, as well as, in this case, a data visualization or a map visualization, how it significantly helped uh, Abraham Lincoln and the Union win the Civil War and abolish slavery in the United States. On the next page, I will show you some references. I just wanted to show this. This is a beautiful painting of John Brown as he was being led away. So this is the last moments of his life, and someone painted this picture, and it's very sad, very solemn, but it's also a very strong painting. These are the references I used. I give you the links, and I will make this deck available for everyone. You can read what Miss Shilton said, and Genevieve Carleton, who I also relied on heavily. Also a couple Wikipedia things on Coral Pleth maps and the history of West Virginia. And with that said, here's some information on me. For those of you folks that don't know, I have a data visualization blog. This year, I started doing something I thought would be important and for the Tableau community. I've been doing what I call the Tableau Community Spotlight, highlighting some of the great work that people within the community have been doing with Tableau and for Tableau. And I've already posted several interviews. I've interviewed Jeff Schaefer. I've interviewed Joshua Milligan and Bridget Cogley. I've interviewed Lillian. And I am going to have in the next few weeks an interview with the Data Duo, as well as Tim Massar. And so I may be pinging some of you to interview some of you, talk a little bit about some of the things you're doing and your thoughts on Tableau and the future of Tableau, and just in general, how we can do things to make our business partners. I don't like to call the people we do work for users. I call them our business partners, because we do collaborate with them. How we can make their lives better and easier, and make it easier for them to understand their data as well. So that was my presentation. I will take it out of this mode, and I will check if there are any questions. It doesn't look like there are any questions. So I thank all of you for giving me this. I'd like to thank the Tableau Fringe Festival for giving me an opportunity to speak today, be able to tell a story, give you folks a new one in your collection of stories that you can tell, like I said, like the Jon Snow one, the Napoleon one. So here's another story that you can tell people that has some interesting aspects to it, as well as go visit Washington, D.C. and go to the Capitol building. I could tell you a story about this painting. So thank you all again. I'm very honored to have had this opportunity to do this, and thanks again.
Thank you, Michael. That was awesome. I could listen to you all day.